At La Rochelle, the harbor should have been full of noise, ropes creaking, sailors shouting, timber groaning against the tide. But in the legend, something changed. After the arrests began in 1307, ships connected to the Knights Templar were said to have vanished from the Atlantic coast of France. Not one boat, a fleet. Carrying men, treasure, records, perhaps even the last secrets of the order itself. And then, silence. No clear manifest, no certain destination. Only a question that has refused to sink. Did part of the Templar order escape by sea? And did Portugal become its sanctuary? To follow that question, we have to slow down. The story is not only about missing ships or hidden gold. It is about fear, power, law, rumor, and the strange way a defeated institution can survive by changing its name. So tonight, we begin not with certainty, but with a harbor. Imagine the Atlantic air, cold and salted, pressing against the stone quays of La Rochelle. Behind the town, France is tightening like a fist. Royal officials are preparing accusations. Prisons are waiting. Across Europe, the Templars still appear powerful, wealthy, armed, international, protected by papal privilege. But power can become dangerous when kings are desperate. And in 1307, one king was very desperate indeed. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. The mystery of La Rochelle survives because the evidence is incomplete. Some of the story belongs to record, some belongs to later legend. And somewhere between the two lies the possibility that the Templars did not simply disappear. Perhaps they moved. The Knights Templar did not begin as a threat. That is one of the first things worth remembering, because later stories often treat them as if they arrived in history already wrapped in secrecy, wealth, and menace. In the beginning, they were something much more practical, and in some ways, more fragile. A small brotherhood of armed religious men trying to protect Christian pilgrims traveling through the dangerous roads of the Holy Land. Their idea was unusual, even startling. A monk was meant to pray, fast, obey, and withdraw from the violence of the world. A knight was trained to fight, to spill blood, to win land and reputation through force. The Templars fused those two lives together. They wore the discipline of the cloister and the equipment of the battlefield. They promised poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they also carried swords. To the medieval mind, this was not the contradiction it may seem to us now. It answered a need. Pilgrims were vulnerable. Crusader states needed defenders. Western Europe, full of noble families with younger sons trained for war, had no shortage of men looking for a holy purpose that still allowed them to remain warriors. The Templars offered exactly that. Violence placed under a sacred rule, and then success changed them. What began as a brotherhood became an institution. Gifts arrived from kings, nobles, widows, merchants, and ordinary believers who wanted to support the defense of the Holy Land or secure spiritual merit. Land was donated. Mills, vineyards, farms, churches, houses, and rights to income accumulated across Europe. A knight might fight in the East, but the money that armed him often came from estates in France, England, Iberia, Italy, or beyond. This is where the Templar story becomes more interesting than the usual legend of buried treasure. Their real power was not simply in gold locked in chests. It was in organization. They learned how to move resources across distance. They maintained houses in many kingdoms. They managed property, collected rents, transported goods, supplied fortresses, and handled money for people powerful enough to matter. In time, they became trusted as a kind of medieval financial network, not a bank in the modern sense, but something close enough to make rulers pay attention. A noble could deposit wealth in one Templar house and draw funds elsewhere. Kings could use them for loans, storage, transfers, and administration. Their reputation rested on discipline and reach. They had brothers who could read accounts, guard valuables, command men, and move through borders with unusual protection. That protection mattered. The Templars answered ultimately to the Pope, not neatly to any one king. They enjoyed privileges that made them difficult for local rulers and bishops to control. In a Europe of overlapping authorities, where every lord guarded his rights and every king tried to expand his, the Templars stood slightly apart. Useful, yes, admired often, but also irritating. A powerful order is tolerated as long as its usefulness outweighs its danger. For a long time, the Templars were useful. They fought, they built, they financed. They gave Christian Europe a sense that the crusading project had a permanent body, a disciplined arm that did not vanish when one king died or one army returned home. Their red cross on a white mantle became one of the most recognizable symbols of medieval Christendom. But symbols can harden into targets. By the late 13th century, the world that had created the Templars was changing. Crusader strongholds in the east had fallen. The old purpose of defending the Holy Land had become more difficult to justify in the same immediate way. The military orders still had wealth and land, but their most famous mission had suffered a devastating defeat. To supporters, this meant the orders were needed more than ever. To critics, it raised a sharper question. Why should these men remain so privileged when Jerusalem was still lost? That question was dangerous because it did not need to be fair in order to be effective. Resentment gathered around the order from several directions. Some people disliked their exemptions. Some envied their property. Some mistrusted their secrecy, though much of that secrecy was simply the internal discipline of a religious order. And rulers, especially rulers under financial strain, understood that moral suspicion could become a political tool. The Templars had become almost too useful, too wealthy, and too independent for their own safety. They existed across borders at a time when kings were trying to make borders mean more. They possessed resources at a time when royal governments were hungry for money. They carried an aura of holiness at a time when holiness could be challenged, investigated, and, under pressure, turned inside out. This does not mean the fall of the Templars was inevitable. History is rarely that tidy. But it does mean that when the attack finally came, it found an order already surrounded by old envy, new politics, and a growing sense that something so powerful must be hiding something. That is the quiet tragedy beneath the louder accusations. The Templars had been built to survive war, distance, and hardship. They had castles, estates, ships, rules, commanders, and brothers trained to obey. But they were less prepared for a different kind of battlefield. One made of debt, rumor, confession, legal procedure, and royal ambition. A sword could be met with a sword. A charge of heresy, spoken in the right court by the right king, was another matter entirely. The fall of the Knights Templar did not begin in a dungeon. It began in the colder rooms of power, where debts were counted, alliances measured, and religious language could be sharpened into a political weapon. At the center of it stood King Philip IV of France, remembered as Philip the Fair, though fairness was not the quality his enemies would have chosen first. He was not a wild man chasing rumors in the dark. He was something more dangerous, a ruler with a strong idea of kingship, a troubled treasury, and a willingness to force the world around him into the shape he wanted. Philip's reign was expensive. Medieval kings were not simply men in crowns sitting above their kingdoms like decorations. They fought wars, maintained courts, rewarded followers, defended claims, and built royal administration. All of this required money, and Philip needed a great deal of it. He had already shown a hard hand toward sources of wealth inside his realm. The Jews of France were expelled and their property seized. Italian bankers faced pressure. Coinage was manipulated. The king's government searched, again and again, for ways to turn financial strain into royal opportunity. The Templars stood directly in that line of sight. They were wealthy. They were international. They had strongholds, estates, financial experience, and a reputation for guarding treasure. They had also lent money to rulers. Whether Philip's debt to them was the sole reason for their destruction is too simple a claim. History rarely hands us motives so cleanly wrapped. But money was certainly part of the atmosphere. A king under financial pressure, looking at a privileged order with vast assets, does not need to invent greed from nothing. He only needs to convince himself that taking those assets is righteous. That is where the papacy becomes essential. The Templars were not just another group of landholders in France. They were a religious military order under papal authority. Philip could not simply treat them like rebellious nobles without risking a broader crisis. To destroy them properly, he needed more than soldiers. He needed accusations with spiritual force. He needed the language of heresy. And he needed a pope who could be pressured. Pope Clement V was in a difficult position from the beginning. He was not ruling from some imaginary height above politics. The papacy in this period was tangled in French influence, scarred by conflict, and vulnerable to royal pressure. Philip had already clashed fiercely with the previous pope, Boniface VIII, in a struggle over royal power, taxation, and spiritual authority. That conflict had left a mark. It showed that Philip was prepared to challenge even the highest religious office in Europe when royal interests were at stake. Clement inherited that world. He had to weigh theology, law, diplomacy, and survival. The Templars were under his protection, but Philip was one of the most powerful monarchs in Christendom. The Pope could hesitate. He could question. He could attempt procedure. But he could not pretend the French king was merely another petitioner waiting politely outside the door. This is one of the unsettling lessons of the Templar affair. Persecution does not always begin with chaos. Sometimes it begins with paperwork. Suspicion had to be organized. Testimony had to be gathered. Charges had to be made believable enough to justify extraordinary action. The accusations that would be aimed at the Templars were shocking. Denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, obscene rituals, improper kisses, idolatry, secrecy twisted into evidence of corruption. To modern ears, they sound almost theatrical, but in medieval Europe, heresy was not a private opinion. It was understood as a disease of the soul that could infect the body of Christian society. A charge like that did not merely accuse a man of wrongdoing. It marked him as a danger to the world. The machinery worked because it joined several fears together. There was fear of hidden sin, fear of secret groups, fear that holy appearances might conceal corruption, fear that institutions with too much independence might be serving themselves rather than God. The Templars, by their very structure, were vulnerable to this kind of attack. They had initiation rites. They lived under internal rules. They possessed wealth. They moved across borders. They were both visible and opaque. That combination is fatal when a powerful enemy decides opacity is proof of guilt. But we should be careful here. To explain how the accusations functioned is not the same as proving they were true. Many confessions were extracted under pressure and torture. Many claims collapse when examined closely. The pattern looks less like the discovery of a vast hidden cult and more like an investigation designed to produce the answers it needed. Once the order had been publicly stained, even innocence became difficult to restore. Mud thrown in the name of God was not easily washed away. Philip understood timing, too. He did not begin by inviting a calm international inquiry. He moved with coordination and secrecy. Orders were prepared. Officials were instructed. The attack would come suddenly, before the Templars could organize a defense, move assets, or appeal effectively to their supporters. This is the mark of a ruler who understood that surprise itself could become evidence. If men are arrested everywhere at once, the public may assume the crime must be enormous. A single arrest can look like a dispute. A mass arrest looks like revelation. And yet beneath the royal confidence there was a strange fragility. If the Templars had truly been guilty in the way Philip claimed, why was so much force needed to secure the story? Why did interrogation become so central? Why did confessions appear under conditions that made them morally and legally suspect even to some medieval observers? The very violence of the process suggests that the king was not simply uncovering a truth. He was building one. This is where the legend of escape begins to feel emotionally plausible, even when the evidence remains uncertain. An order that had spent nearly 2 centuries moving men, money, and information across Christendom suddenly found itself trapped by the machinery of a single kingdom. If some brothers saw danger coming, would they have tried to flee? If ships were available, would they have used them? If Portugal offered a more sympathetic political climate, would it have seemed like a possible refuge? These questions are not proof, but they are not foolish questions either. The destruction of the Templars was not a simple moral cleansing. It was a collision between a wealthy religious order, a financially strained monarchy, and a papacy under immense pressure. Philip did not need every accusation to be true. He needed them to be useful. He needed them to transform creditors into criminals, privilege into suspicion, and property into something that could be seized in the name of faith. By the time the arrests came, the essential victory had already been prepared. The Templars would face chains, interrogators, and public disgrace. But before any prison door closed, their enemies had done something even more damaging. They had made the world ready to believe the worst. Before dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, sealed orders opened across France. The date would later gain a life of its own, pulled into folklore, superstition, and modern myth. But for the Templars inside the Kingdom of France, it was not a symbol. It was a morning of boots at the door. Royal officers moved quickly. Templar houses were entered. Brothers were seized. Property was inventoried. Men who had spent their lives under a religious rule, men who had fought in the East or managed estates in the West, suddenly found themselves treated not as servants of Christendom, but as enemies hidden within it. The shock of the operation is difficult to overstate. Medieval Europe was used to violence, but this was not a battlefield. It was a coordinated legal and political strike against one of the most famous religious orders in the Christian world. The Templars were not accused of ordinary corruption. They were accused of betraying the faith at the very center of their identity. The charges were designed to horrify. They were said to deny Christ during initiation, to spit on the cross, to perform obscene gestures and forbidden acts, to worship strange idols, to keep ceremonies hidden because those ceremonies were wicked. The accusations reached into the most intimate space of the order, the moment when a new brother entered its life. If that moment could be painted as corrupted, then everything built upon it could be condemned. This was not accidental. An attack on the Templars had to do more than say they were greedy or arrogant. Many institutions were greedy. Many nobles were arrogant. Those sins could be criticized, fined, or reformed. Heresy was different. Heresy made the order spiritually poisonous. It allowed the king's campaign to appear not as a seizure of wealth, but as a defense of Christendom itself. That appearance mattered, because on paper, the Templars belonged to the Church. In practice, the French crown had made the first move, and it had made it with such force that everyone else had to respond to a crisis already created. The arrests produced their own momentum. Once the brothers were in custody, once rumors spread, once confessions began to emerge, the question shifted. It was no longer only, "Are these men guilty?" It became, "How could such an enormous accusation have been made unless something was terribly wrong?" Power often works by changing the question. The interrogations that followed were brutal. Many Templars were subjected to torture or the threat of it. Some confessed. Some later withdrew their confessions. Others tried to explain that whatever had been said under agony should not be treated as truth. This is one of the central problems in the whole affair. A confession can sound powerful when read from a document, but the room that produced it matters. The body in pain will often say what the interrogator already expects to hear. The medieval authorities knew this problem better than we sometimes assume. They understood that torture could distort testimony, yet the system still used it, especially when the crime was considered grave and hidden. Heresy was thought to be secret by nature. If a person denied it, denial could be interpreted as cunning. If he confessed under pressure, the confession became confirmation. The accused stood inside a trap whose walls moved inward. For the Templars, the trap was especially tight. Their internal customs, which may once have seemed like discipline, now looked suspicious to outsiders. Their obedience to superiors could be portrayed as conspiracy. Their international reach could be described as a network of corruption. Even their courage could be used against them. A brother who refused to confess might be called stubborn. A brother who confessed and repented might be called proof that the order was rotten. It is tempting to imagine all Templars responding as heroes, standing firm in perfect unity. The real picture was more human and more painful. Some men broke. Some contradicted themselves. Some tried to survive. Some may not have understood the full political storm around them until it had already swallowed them. These were not characters in a legend who knew how history would remember them. They were prisoners facing fear, isolation, and the possibility of death. And outside the prisons, Europe watched. The news spread beyond France with astonishing force. Rulers in other kingdoms received papal and royal pressure to act. The accusation could not remain a French domestic matter, because the Templars were not a French institution. They had houses across Christendom. Their brothers served in many lands. Their property crossed borders. If the order was guilty in France, what did that mean for Portugal, England, Aragon, Castile, Italy, Cyprus? This is where the story becomes uneven, and that unevenness matters. Not every ruler moved with Philip's enthusiasm. In some places, the Templars were arrested reluctantly, examined more cautiously, or treated with less immediate hostility. The response varied because political interests varied. A king who depended on military orders along a frontier might see the Templars differently from a king who saw in them a financial and political obstacle. The same accusation could land differently depending on the soil beneath it. That is one reason Portugal will become so important to our investigation. But in October 1307, the center of gravity was still France. The French arrests created the image that later generations inherited. Proud knights dragged down by accusations too strange to ignore and too useful to be innocent of politics. The event felt sudden, but it had been prepared carefully. It was theatrical, but not empty theater. It had legal forms, but those forms were pressed into service by royal ambition. And then there is the date. Friday the 13th has become almost too famous. Modern culture has wrapped it in bad luck, horror films, and a kind of easy medieval gloom that can actually obscure the real drama. The importance of that Friday was not that the calendar was cursed. It was that a state acted with precision against an institution that believed itself protected by sacred authority. The horror was not superstition, it was administration. Men woke as Templars and ended the day as prisoners. Their houses, once places of prayer, storage, planning, and command, became sites of search and seizure. Their names were tied to crimes that struck at the foundation of their vows. Their silence, whether born of discipline or fear, could now be interpreted as guilt. Their wealth, once evidence of trust, became evidence of corruption. From this moment onward, the order would struggle not only to defend its property or its members, but to defend the meaning of its own past. Had the Templars been faithful warriors brought down by a king's greed? Had they become arrogant and compromised after years of privilege? Had a few strange internal customs been exaggerated into monstrous heresy? Or had the entire affair been shaped from the beginning to produce a conviction that was politically necessary? The records do not allow a simple answer. They give us fragments, confessions, retractions, official proceedings, royal claims, papal hesitation, and later memories. The farther we move from the prison rooms, the more the story begins to divide. One path follows the documents, another follows rumor, and somewhere along that second path, ships begin to slip out of harbor. Because when an order is struck everywhere at once, the imagination looks for those who escaped the net. It looks toward the coast, it looks toward La Rochelle, it looks for missing men, missing cargo, and sails disappearing into the Atlantic before the king's officers could reach them. A harbor is a difficult place to keep a secret. Ships need crews. Crews need food, rope, Water, repairs, orders, payments, and excuses. Cargo has weight. Departures leave witnesses. Even in a medieval port, where records were far thinner than we would like, a fleet does not usually vanish like mist because a good story asks it to. And yet the story of the Templar fleet at La Rochelle refuses to disappear. According to the most enduring version, the Templars possessed ships on the Atlantic coast of France, and when the royal crackdown came in 1307, some of those ships escaped. They carried away brothers of the order, perhaps treasure, perhaps documents, perhaps something more symbolic than material, the continuity of a condemned brotherhood. In some tellings, the ships sailed toward Scotland, in others toward the Iberian Peninsula. In the version that matters most to us, they turned toward Portugal. It is a beautiful story. That is exactly why we should handle it carefully. There is no solid contemporary record proving that a great Templar fleet fled La Rochelle, loaded with the Order's treasure, just before the arrests. The evidence becomes thinner precisely at the point where the legend becomes most cinematic. Later writers, local traditions, and speculative histories have filled the silence with movement. Sails raised in darkness, royal agents arriving too late, treasure spirited away beyond Philip's reach. But silence in the record is not proof of escape. It is only silence. Still, it is not proof against escape either. This is the uncomfortable middle ground, where the historian and the storyteller have to share the same narrow road. The Templars did have maritime connections. They did transport people and goods. They did operate in a world where ports mattered deeply. La Rochelle was an important Atlantic port, and the Order's Western networks were not imaginary. A movement of some men, some goods, or some records by sea is not impossible. What becomes harder to support is the grander claim: a coordinated, treasure-laden fleet disappearing in perfect secrecy, leaving behind no clear trail. The problem is not that medieval people were incapable of secrecy. They were very capable of it. The problem is scale. The larger the escape, the more people must know. The more cargo involved, the more preparation required. The more dramatic the claim, the more we should expect at least some trace close to the event itself. And here, the trail is frustrating. That frustration gave the legend room to grow. When the Templars were arrested in France, not every brother in Europe was instantly imprisoned in the same way. Information traveled quickly by medieval standards, but not instantly. Local conditions varied. Officials differed. Some Templars may have had warning. Others may have understood that pressure was building before the strike fully landed. It is reasonable to imagine fear moving through the order before formal orders reached every door. Fear is a kind of messenger. A rider arrives with news from Paris. A merchant mentions arrests. A cleric repeats a rumor heard on the road. A commander sees the pattern before it is officially explained to him. In a disciplined institution like the temple, men would have known how to move quickly if they believed survival required it. That does not give us a fleet of treasure ships, but it does leave space for smaller, less theatrical acts of escape. And sometimes smaller possibilities are more historically interesting than larger fantasies. Perhaps some men fled. Perhaps some documents were hidden or moved. Perhaps property was quietly placed under protection before it could be seized. Perhaps certain brothers crossed into friendlier territories. These possibilities do not require a perfect conspiracy. They require only urgency, networks, and the instinct to survive. Portugal enters the story not because we can point to a manifest stamped with certainty, but because it offered conditions that made survival more plausible. It was not France. Its king had his own interests. Its frontier history gave military orders practical value. Its Templar presence was established and important. If a fugitive Templar looked south and west, Portugal was not a random destination invented by romance. It was a kingdom where the order had roots, allies, lands, and a reason to be preserved in some form. This is where the missing ships become less important as ships and more important as a symbol. They represent a question. Did the Templars experience their destruction only as victims waiting for judgment? Or did some of them act before the net closed? The official story of the arrests tends to freeze them in place, seized, interrogated, condemned. The fleet legend restores motion. It imagines the order not as a body lying still beneath royal power, but as something with enough warning, discipline, and maritime reach to move beyond the king's grasp. That is emotionally satisfying. It may also be partly true in modest ways, but we should resist the temptation to make every gap in the evidence into a hidden doorway. A missing document is not always a suppressed document. An absent record is not always proof of a successful cover-up. Medieval archives are incomplete for ordinary reasons: fire, neglect, war, damp, administrative chaos, and the simple fact that not everything was written down or preserved. History is full of holes that no one deliberately dug. The La Rochelle story lives inside one of those holes. Later generations looked back at the fall of the Templars and found the official ending unsatisfying. An order so rich, so disciplined, so connected. Could it really have been caught so completely? Could all its secrets have been seized? Could all its leaders have failed to prepare? The mind pushes back. It wants at least one escape route. It wants a night wind, a hidden cargo, a captain who says nothing, a coastline fading behind the stern. In that sense, the legend tells us something true, even if its details remain unproven. It tells us that the Templars had become too large in the imagination to die neatly. Their fall created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed stories of treasure, ships, secret archives, and survival. Some of these stories are likely exaggerations. Some may preserve distorted memories of real movements. Some may have been shaped by later political needs, local pride, or the simple pleasure of a mystery that cannot be fully killed. For our investigation, the important move is not to ask whether every ship in the legend existed exactly as described. It is to ask why Portugal became one of the most believable destinations for survival. Because there, unlike in the pure fantasy of hidden gold, we find firmer ground. We find a kingdom that did not treat the Templar problem in the same way France did. We find a king skilled enough to obey the language of Rome while preserving what he wanted to keep. We find lands, castles, and men who could be transformed rather than erased. We find a future order of Christ, standing where total destruction should have left only ruins. So the missing ships remain suspended between possibility and myth. Maybe a fleet escaped La Rochelle. Maybe only a handful of frightened men found passage along the Atlantic roads. Maybe no dramatic departure happened at all, and the legend was born afterward from the need to believe that someone, somewhere, outwitted Philip's trap. But the harbor remains powerful because it marks the edge of what the records can tell us. On one side, arrests, interrogations, papal proceedings, and royal force. On the other, open water. And whenever history reaches open water, certainty becomes harder to command. To understand why the fleet story survived, we have to step away from the vanished ships for a moment and look at the world that made them believable. The Templars were not landlocked monks with swords who somehow wandered into a maritime legend by accident. They lived in a world connected by roads, rivers, and sea lanes. Their mission depended on movement. Men had to travel from Europe to the Eastern Mediterranean. Horses, weapons, grain, cloth, coin, letters, and orders had to move with them. A fortress in the Holy Land could not survive on courage alone. It needed supplies, and supplies needed routes. The sea was not a romantic backdrop to the Templar story. It was infrastructure. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the military orders became part of the hard machinery of Crusader survival. Ports were lifelines. Without ships, a Western knight could not easily reach Acre, Tripoli, or the coastal strongholds that remained after earlier losses inland. Without maritime transport, reinforcements arrived too slowly, provisions became uncertain, and the Christian presence in the Levant became even more fragile than it already was. The Templars did not operate alone in this world. Italian maritime powers such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa dominated much of the shipping that connected Western Europe to the Eastern Mediterranean. Merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and churchmen all used routes shaped by commerce as much as crusading zeal. But the Templars had their own houses, their own logistical needs, and in some contexts, their own vessels or access to vessels. They understood the sea because they had to. This is an important correction to the legend. A Templar escape by sea is not plausible, because the order was magical, all-knowing, or secretly commanding a hidden navy larger than any king suspected. It is plausible in the more modest sense that the Templars belonged to a maritime world. They had reasons to use ports. They had experience moving people and goods. They had contacts across regions. They had brothers who understood that distance could be managed if one controlled the right nodes. A port, in medieval life, was not simply a place where ships rested. It was a hinge. Goods turned there from land to water. News changed hands. Languages mixed. A man could arrive as a pilgrim, a merchant, a soldier, a courier, or a fugitive, and the difference was not always obvious at first glance. Ports were noisy, practical, suspicious places. They were also places where identities could blur just enough for a frightened traveler to keep moving. This is why La Rochelle matters in the imagination. It sat on the Atlantic edge of France, facing outward. From there, the sea did not lead only to one destination. It opened toward England, Iberia, and beyond. A ship leaving that coast could become part of many stories, because its route could not be guessed by watching it vanish at the horizon. The Atlantic does not give explanations. It gives possibilities. But we should not let possibility become certainty. The Templars' maritime activity is real enough as a broad historical fact. The leap from maritime activity to a secret escaping fleet is where caution must return. The order needed ships and sea routes for administration, pilgrimage, warfare, and supply. That does not automatically mean it had a carefully prepared evacuation plan in 1307. Institutions can be excellent at routine movement and still fail under sudden political attack. A network that transports grain and men during normal times is not the same thing as a conspiracy ready to save itself overnight. And yet routine movement can become emergency movement very quickly. That is the human detail worth holding on to. The same paths used for ordinary business can become escape routes when danger arrives. A harbor known for supply can become a harbor of flight. A captain hired for transport can become a man carrying more than cargo. A brother sent with documents may suddenly understand that the documents matter more than his own safety. History often changes the meaning of ordinary things after the fact. A warehouse becomes a hiding place. A road becomes a line of retreat. A ship becomes a rumor. The Templars' world was full of these ordinary channels. Their houses across Europe were not isolated monuments. They were connected through obligation, correspondence, money, and command. A preceptory in the countryside might seem far from the sea, but the rents it collected could eventually support war overseas. A commander in a port might deal with merchants as often as knights. A coastal property might matter less for drama than for storage, loading, and access. This networked quality is one reason the Templars inspired both admiration and suspicion. To supporters, it showed discipline and holy efficiency. To enemies, it looked like a body within the body of Christendom, with its own circulation system. Money flowed. Orders moved. Men obeyed superiors who were not always local. When trust held, this was impressive. When trust broke, the same structure looked sinister. The sea intensified that suspicion, because the sea was harder for rulers to control than land. A road could be watched. A gate could be closed. A castle could be besieged, but a coastline was porous. Even powerful kings could not place a hand on every inlet, every merchant vessel, every private arrangement made under cover of trade. Medieval states were growing more ambitious, but their reach still had limits. The ocean reminded them of those limits. For later generations, this mattered enormously. The Templars seemed like the kind of organization that could exploit those limits. They had discipline. They had money. They had international connections. They had a reason to flee. They had enemies who wanted their property. Place those ingredients beside a major port, and the legend almost writes itself. Almost. The careful version of the story must leave room for disappointment. We may want a precise departure, the hour, the number of ships, the names of captains, the cargo, the destination. The record does not give us that. What it gives us is a wider world in which such a story could be imagined without feeling absurd. That distinction is not a small technicality. It is the difference between history and historical myth. A myth does not always begin as a lie. Sometimes it begins as a reasonable possibility that people keep decorating because the undecorated version feels too plain. Perhaps a few Templar-associated vessels left ports around the time of the crisis. Perhaps some brothers used maritime routes to escape pressure. Perhaps property or information moved in ways that later became exaggerated into treasure. None of this requires a fleet glittering with relics in the moonlight. It requires a frightened institution using the tools it already had. And that, in a way, is more believable. The real sea roads of the temple were made of logistics, not fantasy. They connected farms to ports, ports to fortresses, fortresses to the survival of a cause that had already begun to fail. They carried ambition, faith, supplies, and exhaustion. They carried men who had taken vows and then discovered that vows did not protect them from politics. So when people later imagined Templar sails escaping into the Atlantic, they were not inventing from nothing. They were exaggerating from a truth. This was an order built on movement. The mystery is not whether the Templars knew how to use the sea. They did. The mystery is whether, at the moment of their greatest danger, some of them used those sea roads one final time, not to reinforce a crusader fortress, not to carry pilgrims, not to move coin for kings, but to preserve whatever could still be saved from a world closing in behind them. And if they did, the Atlantic would not have been the end of the story. It would have been the passage into another kingdom. Portugal was not an accidental refuge in this story. To understand why it mattered, we have to imagine the kingdom not as a quiet corner at the edge of a map, but as a hard frontier society shaped by pressure from land and sea. Medieval Portugal faced the Atlantic on one side and the long memory of war on the other. Its identity had been forged in the slow, violent expansion of Christian rule across the western Iberian Peninsula. Castles were not decoration there. Military orders were not ceremonial relics. They were tools of survival, settlement, and royal ambition. This is where the Templars fit naturally. In France, the order could look like a privileged international corporation with too much land and too little accountability. In Portugal, it could look like something more immediately useful. Armed, disciplined men who held territory, defended vulnerable zones, helped organize settlement, and served a kingdom still defining itself. The difference is crucial. The same institution can appear dangerous in one political environment and indispensable in another. Portugal's rulers had long worked with military religious orders because those orders solved practical problems. They could guard frontier regions. They could help populate and administer lands. They could place trained fighters in strategic positions without requiring the king to build every structure of control from nothing. In a young kingdom, that mattered. The Templars were part of this world not through rumor, but through land and stone. Their influence in Portugal reached back generations before the arrests in France. They held important properties and strongholds, and their role was woven into the kingdom's military and territorial development. They were not strangers arriving suddenly with mysterious cargo from La Rochelle. They were already there, already embedded, already useful. That makes Portugal a different kind of sanctuary, not a hidden cave for fugitives, not a fantasy island of secret rites, a functioning kingdom with political reasons to preserve what France wanted destroyed. This is often where popular versions of the story rush too quickly. They imagine desperate Templars sailing into Portugal as if the kingdom were simply a convenient hiding place, a blank space beyond Philip's reach. But Portugal was not blank. It had its own king, laws, clergy, ambitions, rivalries, and diplomatic constraints. Any Templar survival there would have to pass through politics. It would have to be negotiated, legalized, renamed, or absorbed. In other words, survival would not look like a conspiracy. It would look like administration. That may sound less thrilling than a chest of relics carried under sail, but it is far more revealing. Institutions rarely survive catastrophe by remaining unchanged in secret. They survive by becoming useful to someone with power. They survive by fitting into a new legal shape. They survive because a ruler looks at them and sees not a problem to erase, but an asset to redirect. Portugal gave the former Templar world that possibility. Geography helped. The kingdom stood at the western edge of Latin Christendom, facing the Atlantic, connected to Iberian politics, but not identical with them. It was close enough to the larger Christian world to care about papal authority, yet far enough from the French royal center that Philip's influence did not fall with the same weight. Distance did not mean independence from Rome, but it did create room for maneuver. And maneuver was everything. If the Templars were under suspicion, a Portuguese king could not simply announce that he rejected the entire process. That would have been reckless. No ruler wanted to be seen protecting heresy, but he could slow the process. He could examine the local situation. He could distinguish between the order condemned elsewhere and the men and properties useful within his own realm. He could obey the form of papal decisions while shaping the outcome on the ground. This is the kind of politics that leaves fewer dramatic scenes but deeper consequences. Portugal's frontier character also changed how one might judge the Templars' value. A military order in a settled, wealthy, centralized region could become an object of resentment. A military order in a frontier kingdom could still be part of the machinery that made the kingdom secure. The Templars' castles, lands, and disciplined manpower were not merely symbols of privilege. They were investments in control. And control for a medieval king was precious. The sea also mattered, though not always in the way the legend suggests. Portugal's Atlantic position made it believable as a destination for those imagining Templar escape. A ship from the French coast could, in theory, move toward Iberian waters. Ports connected worlds that politics tried to separate. But the deeper importance of Portugal was not that it could receive a secret fleet. It was that it could receive a broken institution and make something legal out of the remains. That is a more durable form of refuge. The word sanctuary can mislead us if we picture safety as stillness. Medieval sanctuary was rarely simple peace. It was negotiation under pressure. It was protection with conditions. It was a king deciding how much risk an institution was worth. For the Templars in Portugal, survival would depend less on hiding in the shadows than on being reclassified in the light. This is why the Portuguese chapter of the Templar story has such force. It does not need every legend to be true. Even if no treasure fleet arrived from La Rochelle, Portugal still becomes one of the most important places where the Templar legacy did not end cleanly. The men, lands, habits, and strategic memory attached to the order could be preserved, not because history forgot to destroy them, but because a king found a way to keep them. That distinction matters. A forgotten survivor is one kind of mystery. A protected survivor is another. And Portugal's story points toward the second. At the edge of Christendom, where castles watched old frontiers and the Atlantic opened into uncertain distances, the Templar name was becoming dangerous. But the substance beneath the name, the property, discipline, military experience, and usefulness, had not lost its value. Names could be condemned, assets could be transferred, vows could be redirected, a cross could be altered, placed under new authority, and carried forward into a different age. The question, then, is not simply whether fleeing Templars came to Portugal. Some may have. The evidence does not allow us to speak with perfect confidence. The larger question is why Portugal was prepared to receive the Templar inheritance at all. The answer lies in the kingdom itself. Frontier-minded, politically careful, and unwilling to throw away a powerful instrument just because France had turned it into a scandal. Portugal did not need to believe in secret treasure to see value in the temple. It only needed to recognize what the order had always been at its most practical: land, men, discipline, and reach. In France, those qualities had made the Templars vulnerable. In Portugal, they made them worth saving. King Dinis of Portugal did not save the Templars by thunderous defiance. That is important, Because the popular imagination often wants a dramatic rebel king, a monarch standing before Rome and France, declaring that the brothers of the temple would never be touched while he wore the crown. It makes a fine scene. It is also too simple. Dinis was subtler than that. He ruled a kingdom that needed stability, land, money, military strength, and diplomatic caution. He could not afford to look like a protector of heresy. No medieval Christian king could safely wear that label, but he also had little reason to destroy a useful institution merely because Philip IV of France had turned against it. Portugal's Templars were not an abstract scandal to him. They were part of the kingdom's working structure. So Dinis took the path of controlled resistance, not open rebellion, not blind obedience, something quieter and in many ways more effective. When pressure against the Templars spread from France across Europe, Portugal had to respond. The accusations were too serious to ignore. Papal authority mattered. The charge of heresy could not simply be waved away as French politics, even if French politics had done much to create the crisis. Dinis had to move within the language of law and faith. He had to appear obedient while protecting what he considered valuable. This is where his political skill becomes visible. A less careful ruler might have made a doomed gesture. A more submissive one might have surrendered everything. Dinis did neither. He allowed investigation and legal process, but he did not pursue the Templars with the same destructive appetite seen in France. The Portuguese response lacked the same heat, the same theatrical violence, the same need to produce a public catastrophe. That difference matters because persecution is never only about accusation. It is also about the attitude of the power receiving the accusation. In France, the Templars were useful as enemies. Their fall served the king's treasury, authority, and image. In Portugal, they were useful as assets. Their lands, castles, and manpower could be folded into the kingdom's future. Destroying them completely would not have strengthened Dinis in the same way. It might have weakened him. So he waited. He maneuvered. He protected the inheritance without pretending the old name could remain untouched forever. The phrase "quiet refusal" captures the heart of his policy. Dinis did not necessarily refuse the Pope directly. He refused the French version of the story. The idea that the only possible response to the Templar scandal was annihilation. He treated the order's local substance as separable from its condemned identity. That distinction opened a path through the crisis. It is a very medieval solution. Modern people often imagine institutions as brands. Destroy the name, and the thing is gone. Medieval power was more material. A name mattered, yes. A rule mattered. Papal approval mattered. But land remained land. Castles remained castles. Experienced men remained experienced men. Administrative habits did not evaporate because a seal was broken. If those things could be placed under a new legal framework, then destruction could become transformation. Dinis understood that. He also understood that Portugal's independence had to be defended carefully. France was powerful, but it was not Portugal's master. Rome was spiritually supreme, but papal decisions still had to pass through local realities. A king on the western edge of Europe could not openly deny the church, yet he could shape implementation. He could ask, what exactly is being condemned? The name, the rule, the men, the property, the mission. And who should inherit what remains? Those questions were not small technicalities. They were the escape route. Because if the Templars as an order were condemned, Their Portuguese possessions did not have to vanish into the hands of foreign powers or hostile interests. They could be preserved for a new foundation, one that Rome could approve and Portugal could control. This was not secrecy in the childish sense of hidden chambers and whispered passwords. It was legal alchemy, changing the form so the substance could survive. There is something almost cold in the brilliance of it. The Templars did not need Dinis to prove their innocence before all Europe. That battle was likely unwinnable. The French campaign had already poisoned the Order's reputation too deeply. What they needed was a ruler who would not allow the condemnation of a name to become the waste of a system. Dinis offered that. He did not resurrect the temple. He redirected it. Of course, we should not turn him into a sentimental hero. Kings rarely protect institutions out of pure affection. Dinis had reasons of state. The former Templar assets could serve the crown. Their military and territorial value could strengthen Portugal. Preserving them under a new order also meant keeping them within a framework favorable to royal interests. Compassion may have played a role, but calculation certainly did. That does not make his actions less significant. It makes them more believable. History is often changed not by noble speeches, but by decisions that satisfy several needs at once. Dinis could appear faithful to the church, prevent valuable lands from being lost, avoid the French model of violent destruction, and retain a body of men and resources useful to the kingdom. It was a solution elegant enough to survive, because it did not require anyone to admit too much. Rome could say the old order was gone. Portugal could ensure that much of what mattered did not disappear. This is why the Portuguese survival of the Templar legacy feels so different from the La Rochelle fleet legend. The fleet story depends on absence, missing ships, missing cargo, missing proof. Dinis's role depends on presence. Castles, charters, property, negotiations, institutional continuity. It is less cinematic at first glance, but much stronger as history. And yet the two stories feed each other. If men did flee by sea, Portugal was the kind of place where they might hope to be absorbed. If no fleet came at all, Portugal still explains how the Templar inheritance could pass into another life. The legend imagines escape across water. The record shows survival through law. Together, they create the strange double image that has kept the story alive for centuries. The vanished and the documented, the fugitive and the sanctioned, the rumor at sea and the royal decision on land. Dinis stands at the hinge between them. He did not need to deny the storm. He simply refused to let it wash away everything in its path. By the time the old Templar name became impossible to defend openly, Portugal was already moving toward a different answer. The brothers could not remain exactly what they had been. Their order had been too badly damaged, too publicly condemned, too dangerous to preserve unchanged. But if the shell had cracked, the contents could still be poured into another vessel. That vessel would have a new name. It would carry papal approval. It would serve Portuguese interests. And in the memory of later generations, it would make people wonder whether the Templars had truly died at all, or whether, in Portugal, they had simply learned the oldest art of survival, how to become something else without entirely ceasing to be themselves. Tomar does not feel like a footnote. Even before you know its history, the place has the confidence of something built to last. The fortress rises in central Portugal with the heavy logic of a military world. Walls, towers, controlled approaches, a command over the surrounding land. It is not the kind of setting that needs embellishment. The stones already make the argument. If La Rochelle belongs to the mystery of departure, Tomar belongs to the evidence of arrival, or, more carefully, the evidence of rootedness. The Templars were not merely passing through Portugal. At Tomar, they had power you could touch. Their presence was not a rumor moving across water, but a fortified reality built into the landscape. The castle and its religious complex became one of the great anchors of the order in Portugal, a place where military purpose and spiritual identity stood side by side. Prayer and defense were not separate worlds here. They shared walls. That is what makes Tomar so useful to our investigation. It pulls the story away from the glitter of imaginary treasure and brings it back to the real wealth of the medieval temple: land, fortification, jurisdiction, memory, and position. A fortress is a kind of treasure, but not the kind that fits in a chest. It stores authority. It stores fear. It stores the labor of generations. It says to allies and enemies alike, someone intends to remain. For the Templars in Portugal, Tomar represented more than a safe house. It was part of a network of control. Castles like this mattered because geography mattered. Roads, rivers, agricultural lands, border zones, and lines of communication shaped power long before modern maps made them look clean. A stronghold could secure territory, organize settlement, protect routes, and project royal or religious authority into regions where authority was never automatic. This is why the popular obsession with hidden Templar gold can feel strangely small. Gold can be stolen, melted, divided, hidden, lost. A fortress changes the behavior of everyone around it. It shapes where people travel, where they settle, where they pay dues, where they seek protection, and whom they fear crossing. If we are looking for the true Templar inheritance in Portugal, Tomar tells us to look not beneath the floor for secret vaults, but at the structure itself. The real secret is that power often looks ordinary once it has been built. Stone, charters, fields, obligations, men trained to obey. The Templars understood this. Their strength was not simply battlefield courage. Courage is dramatic, but it burns quickly if not supplied. The Order's deeper strength lay in its ability to organize. A castle needed maintenance. A garrison needed food. A chapel needed clergy. Estates needed managers. Legal privileges needed defending. Accounts needed keeping. Tomar was not only a monument to faith in war, it was an administrative machine. And machines are hard to kill when many people depend on them. That is one reason Portugal could not treat the Templar question as if it were merely a matter of guilt or innocence. The Order's presence was embedded in the kingdom's working body. Remove it carelessly, and you did not just punish suspected heretics. You disrupted landholding, defense, local economies, and royal strategy. France could afford to imagine the Templars as a dangerous body to be cut out. Portugal had to ask what arteries might be severed in the process. Tomar made that question visible. It also complicates the idea of secrecy. We often picture secret survival as something hidden underground. But in Portugal, the Templar legacy survived partly because it was too visible to ignore. Their holdings were not a rumor. Their usefulness was not obscure. Their fortress did not vanish when the Order's name became dangerous. It remained there, demanding a decision. What do you do with a condemned Order's castle? You can confiscate it. You can abandon it. You can hand it to rivals. Or you can find a way to keep its function alive under a new name. King Dinis's answer becomes easier to understand when standing, even imaginatively, before Tomar. This was not sentiment. It was statecraft. A ruler looking at such a stronghold saw more than scandal. He saw investment. He saw military infrastructure. He saw a spiritual military tradition that could be redirected toward Portuguese priorities if only the legal problem could be solved. The fortress also helps us separate two kinds of continuity. The first is the romantic kind. Secret brothers preserving hidden rights, guarding forbidden knowledge, meeting in darkness as the world believes them gone. It has obvious appeal. It flatters the mystery. It turns survival into theater. The second kind is quieter and more durable. Institutions adapting through property, personnel, and function. Men who once served under one rule may serve under another. Lands once attached to one order may be granted to a new one. Symbols may shift. Documents may be rewritten. A chapel may hear the same prayers under a different authority. This kind of continuity does not need to hide from history. It passes through history wearing legal clothes. Tomar points toward the second kind. That does not mean there were no private loyalties, no grief, no whispered memories among former Templars. We should assume there were. Men do not surrender an identity overnight because officials alter its status. A brother who had lived under the temple's discipline would not simply forget the old vows, the old commanders, the old dead. But personal memory is not the same as a vast occult conspiracy. It is more human and perhaps more haunting. Imagine a former Templar at Tomar after the old order had been condemned. The walls are still there. The routines may continue in altered form. The land still needs managing. The kingdom still needs service. But the name that gave meaning to his life has become dangerous. The cross he once wore proudly is now burdened with accusation. He survives, but survival comes with a wound. He must continue under a world that has officially declared his former identity broken. That is the emotional weight of Tomar. It is not a ghost story. It is a story of continuity after humiliation. The fortress remembered because stone is stubborn. It does not accept legal condemnation in the way men must. A royal decree can dissolve an institution, but it cannot make a castle unbuilt. It cannot erase the strategic reason that castle existed. It cannot instantly unmake the habits of those who served there. And so Tomar became a place where the Templar past could be transformed rather than simply buried. Later generations would look at it and see confirmation of many things, some reasonable, some extravagant. They would see Templar endurance. They would see hidden meaning. They would see links to Portugal's maritime future. They would see, sometimes, more than the evidence allows. But their instinct that Tomar mattered was not wrong. It mattered because it was real. In the wider story of the missing fleet and the Portuguese sanctuary, Tomar gives us something firmer than rumor. It shows us why Portugal was not merely a destination on a speculative map. It was a kingdom where the temple had roots deep enough to be repurposed. If ships came, they came toward a landscape already marked by the order. If no ships came, the inheritance was already waiting on Portuguese soil. The harbor may have gone silent. Tomar did not. It remained, holding in its walls the simplest and most difficult truth about the Templars in Portugal. They did not survive because of magic or treasure or a perfect secret. They survived because power, once built into land and stone, can be renamed more easily than it can be erased. The death of an institution is rarely as clean as the sentence that announces it. A name can be abolished in a formal act. A seal can be broken. A rule can be declared void. Property can be reassigned on parchment with tidy lines and solemn language. But the human and material reality underneath does not disappear at the same speed. Men remain. Buildings remain. Habits remain. Fields still need tenants. Fortresses still need guardians. A kingdom still needs the machinery that helped it hold itself together. This is the space in which the Portuguese Templars survived, not by pretending nothing had happened, not by openly restoring the old order, but by passing through condemnation into a new legal form. After the wider suppression of the Knights Templar, the problem in Portugal was practical as much as spiritual. The order's name had become impossible to defend in the old way. Across Europe, the temple had been stained by accusation and dissolved under papal authority. To keep it unchanged would have risked a confrontation Portugal did not need. But to scatter its lands and dismantle its usefulness would have been wasteful, perhaps even dangerous. So the answer was neither martyrdom nor erasure. It was transformation. The new body that emerged was the Order of Christ. It carried papal sanction, which mattered enormously. Without that approval, any survival of the Templar inheritance could be framed as disobedience or worse, as sheltering a condemned brotherhood. With approval, the same lands, resources, and men could be brought under a legitimate religious military institution. The scandalous old name was gone. The useful structure could continue. There is a quiet brilliance in this solution, and also a quiet ambiguity. On the surface, Rome could say the Templars had been suppressed. Portugal could say it had obeyed. The old order had not been restored in name. A new one had been created. But beneath that surface, continuity was hard to miss. Former Templar properties did not simply dissolve into air. Their strategic value did not vanish. Men trained in the discipline of a military order did not become blank souls the moment a new title was written above them. This is where the story becomes more interesting than the legend. A secret fleet is dramatic because it imagines escape as movement through darkness. The Order of Christ is dramatic in a different way because it suggests survival in plain sight. The thing that outlived the Templars did not have to hide behind a false wall. It stood under a new name, protected by law, useful to a king, and acceptable to the church. That is not a loophole in history. It is history doing what history often does, making compromises that later generations mistake for mysteries. For the former Templars in Portugal, the change must have been both rescue and loss. Rescue because it preserved a path forward. Loss because the old identity could not be spoken with the same confidence. A man who had once belonged to the temple now had to live with the knowledge that the institution shaping his vows had been condemned in the eyes of Christendom. Even if he believed the charges were false, the world had changed around him. Survival demanded obedience to that change. This is easy to underestimate. We often treat institutional continuity as if it were bloodless, a matter of charters, titles, and property transfer. But for the men inside these structures, a name was not merely a label. It carried memory, discipline, brotherhood, and reputation. To become something else was not a costume change. It was a negotiation with disgrace. And yet, the alternative was extinction. The Order of Christ offered a way for Portugal to preserve what mattered most to the crown: territory, military capacity, administrative experience, and a religious framework for service. It also allowed the church to avoid the embarrassment of leaving valuable assets in chaos. Everyone involved could claim a form of victory. Rome had condemned the temple. Portugal had not wasted its inheritance. The men who could be absorbed had a future. This is why the Portuguese solution feels almost modern in its realism. No one had to say, "The Templars live." In fact, it was better if no one said that too loudly. The safer claim was narrower. A new order now exists, properly authorized, serving legitimate purposes. But memory does not obey legal boundaries. People remembered where the lands came from. They remembered the old strongholds. They remembered the men who had served before and after the change. The past remained visible under the fresh paint. That visibility is one reason the Templar legend clung so tightly to Portugal. The country did not merely host rumors of survival. It produced a documented institutional afterlife that looked from a distance like resurrection. The temple had been condemned, yet in Portugal, its assets and traditions passed into another order. For anyone inclined toward mystery, this was irresistible. For anyone inclined toward careful history, it was still significant, not because it proves hidden treasure or secret doctrine, but because it shows how political intelligence can preserve continuity after formal destruction. The Order of Christ was not simply the Knights Templar wearing a mask. That would be too crude. It had its own legal identity, its own approved existence, and its own developing role within Portuguese history. But neither was it born from nothing. It emerged from a landscape already shaped by the temple. Its inheritance carried weight. Its future would be built, at least in part, on foundations laid by the condemned order. That is the balance we have to keep. Too much skepticism, and we miss the remarkable continuity. Too much romance, and we turn legal survival into fantasy. The truth is subtler. Portugal did not rescue the Templar name. It rescued much of the Templar substance. This distinction helps us understand why the story has such lasting power. Names matter because they are how institutions are recognized. Substance matters because it is how institutions act. Philip IV and the machinery of condemnation helped destroy the first. Portugal helped preserve parts of the second. And in the long memory of history, substance can be stubborn. A castle under a new order is still a castle. A former Templar brother under a new rule still carries old training in his bones. Lands once administered for one sacred mission can be redirected toward another. A symbol can be altered and still echo what came before. The past does not need to survive perfectly in order to survive meaningfully. That is what happened in Portugal. The condemned order did not rise again untouched, as legends sometimes imply. It was not a secret empire waiting beneath the surface of Europe. It was wounded, renamed, absorbed, and repurposed. But it was not entirely erased. In the end, this may be more remarkable than the myth. A fleet vanishing into the Atlantic can be imagined in a single night. Legal transformation takes patience. It requires negotiation, authority, timing, and a ruler who understands that destruction can be redirected into ownership. The Order of Christ was not a sudden miracle. It was a carefully permitted continuation, built from the remains of something too useful to throw away. And so the Templar story in Portugal turns on a paradox. The order survived because it accepted that it could not remain the same. Its old name died. Its inheritance learned to answer to another. The word treasure is dangerous. It shines too brightly. The moment it enters a story, everything around it begins to bend toward the image of locked chests, jeweled chalices, secret relics, and coins stacked in underground chambers. With the Templars, that pull is especially strong. They were wealthy. They were secretive enough to outsiders. They fell suddenly. Some of their assets became difficult to trace. Add a missing fleet at La Rochelle, and the imagination does the rest. But the real treasure of the Templars was probably not gold, or at least not mainly gold. Gold is portable, dramatic, and easy to picture. It gives the legend a shape the mind can hold. A ship leaves France in the night. Beneath its deck lies the wealth of the temple, hidden from Philip IV forever. The vessel reaches Portugal. The treasure is buried, guarded, whispered about, passed from brother to brother through centuries. It is a satisfying story because it turns institutional survival into a heist. But history is often less cinematic and more interesting. The Templars' wealth was not concentrated only in treasure rooms. Much of it was tied to land, rights, rents, buildings, agricultural production, mills, vineyards, livestock, donations, and obligations. Their strength lay in a system. They knew how to collect, manage, transfer, defend, and repurpose resources across distance. A chest of coins could be seized. A network was harder to understand and harder to fully destroy. This is the first adjustment we need to make. When we ask whether the Templars carried treasure to Portugal, we should not only ask what objects they may have moved, we should ask what knowledge moved with them, what habits, what contacts, what administrative memory, what skills in logistics, discipline, finance, fortification, and command. Those things do not glitter. They are also harder to confiscate. A king's officer can inventory a storehouse. He can count silver. He can seal a door. But he cannot easily seize the experience inside a commander's head. He cannot weigh a lifetime of managing estates. He cannot melt down maritime knowledge, frontier practice, or the trust between men who have served under the same rule. He can destroy a name and take property. He cannot instantly erase the methods that made the property valuable. This may be the most important treasure Portugal preserved. The Order of Christ did not need a secret mountain of gold to matter. It inherited something more durable, a tradition of organized service. It could draw upon lands once connected to the temple. It could absorb men shaped by military religious discipline. It could continue certain functions under a safer legal identity. The wealth was not simply what the Templars owned, it was what they knew how to do. This reframes the legend without killing it entirely. Perhaps some portable wealth did move during the crisis. It would be strange to insist that no valuables, documents, or movable assets were ever hidden, transferred, or protected. Institutions under threat often try to preserve what they can. A few chests may have changed hands. Records may have been carried away. Reliquaries, coin, seals, or documents may have vanished into private custody. The evidence does not allow us to describe this with confidence, but the possibility itself is not absurd. What becomes misleading is the idea that the Templar mystery depends on one spectacular treasure. That idea may say more about us than about them. We like treasure because it gives history a secret center. It suggests that all the confusion, violence, politics, and legal maneuvering were really about a hidden object waiting to be found. It turns moral ambiguity into a treasure hunt. But the fall of the Templars was not a puzzle box designed for later centuries. It was a political and religious catastrophe involving men, land, institutions, and power. The true valuables were often visible. Tomar was treasure, not because of something buried beneath it, but because it commanded land and memory. Legal continuity was treasure because it allowed a condemned inheritance to keep functioning. Maritime experience was treasure because Portugal faced the sea. Networks were treasure because isolated men are vulnerable, but connected men can survive shocks. Discipline was treasure because it turns scattered resources into force. And institutional memory may have been the greatest treasure of all. Memory tells a group how to act when conditions change. It preserves procedures, loyalties, caution, and ambition. A former Templar did not need to carry a secret map to be valuable. He carried training. He knew how command worked. He knew how estates supported war. He knew the importance of ports, supply lines, vows, hierarchy, and reputation. In a new order, under a new name, those habits could quietly continue. This is not mystical. It is practical, and practicality is often what survives. A romantic legend asks, where did they hide the gold? A better historical question asks, what did Portugal manage to keep? The answer is not as simple, but it is richer. Portugal kept access to lands and fortified places. It kept a useful body of military religious experience. It kept the possibility of channeling old crusading energy into new royal projects. It kept a structure through which service, faith, and expansion could be organized. That is a treasure no thief could carry in one sack. There is also a moral irony here. Philip IV attacked the Templars in part because their wealth and independence made them vulnerable. He could seize assets, stain reputations, and help bring down the order in name. But the more abstract forms of their wealth escaped him more easily. Knowledge crossed borders in people. Habits survived in institutions. Reputation, though damaged, could be reshaped in places where local politics allowed it. In France, the Templar legacy was made toxic. In Portugal, parts of it became useful again. This does not mean Portugal preserved some pure, unchanged Templar essence. We should avoid that fantasy. The Order of Christ was not a frozen temple waiting for the right century to reveal itself. It developed in Portuguese conditions, under Portuguese authority, with its own purposes. What survived was not an untouched secret, but a transformed inheritance. That is how most real inheritances work. They do not pass from one age to another without alteration. They are edited by need. They lose pieces. They gain meanings. They become useful in ways their founders might not have imagined. The Templar legacy in Portugal was not a relic sealed in wax. It was living material, and living material changes. This is why the treasure story remains powerful even when we strip away its golden exaggerations, because underneath it lies a real intuition. Something did survive. Not necessarily the treasure people dream about. Not necessarily a fleet full of sacred relics. Not necessarily a secret archive proving some grand hidden history, but a body of resources, skills, places, and memories passed from a condemned order into a new one. The treasure was not only what the Templars could hide. It was what they had built so deeply into Portugal that it could be renamed and still continue. And perhaps that is why the legend keeps returning to ships. A ship is a perfect image of portable survival. It carries the past away before enemies can seize it. But Portugal's Templar inheritance may have survived less like cargo and more like a root system. Cut the visible trunk, and something beneath the soil still feeds new growth. Gold would have made the story simpler. The truth, as usual, left a more complicated inheritance. The secret fleet survives because it gives the Templar story an exit. Without it, the fall of the order is almost unbearably controlled. Philip IV moves, officers arrest, interrogators question, confessions are produced, the papacy bends, the name is condemned. The great military brotherhood that once guarded pilgrims and held castles across Christendom is reduced to prisoners, legal proceedings, and scattered property. It is a grim story of power winning. The fleet changes the emotional shape. It says, not all of them were caught. Not everything was seized. Somewhere, beyond the reach of royal officers and prison clerks, the order acted. Ships left harbor. Men escaped the net. Treasure, or records, or memory, or simply dignity, moved into open water. That is why the legend is hard to kill. It answers a human need before it answers a historical question. But need is not evidence. The claim that a Templar fleet escaped from La Rochelle rests in a difficult place. It is not completely ridiculous, because the Templars did use maritime routes and had reason to move men and goods. La Rochelle was a real Atlantic port, not a decorative setting invented for atmosphere. The order's networks were broad enough that flight, warning, and movement are all plausible in limited forms. But the stronger version, a substantial fleet vanishing with the central treasure of the temple, remains unproven. That distinction matters. A story can be possible without being established. It can be rooted in real conditions and still grow beyond what the record supports. The fleet legend lives exactly there, in the space between "this could have happened in some form" and "we can demonstrate that it happened as later accounts describe." The gaps in the record have done much of the work. Archives rarely give us the full life of a medieval institution. They preserve what was written, copied, valued, stored, and lucky enough to survive fire, damp, war, neglect, and politics. When a dramatic silence appears, later imagination rushes in. Missing records become missing ships. Missing property becomes hidden treasure. Missing men become a secret brotherhood carried safely away. It is not hard to see why. The Templars were already perfect material for legend. They were religious, military, wealthy, international, and destroyed under accusations that many later readers have found suspicious. Their rituals were private. Their finances were complex. Their fall was sudden. Their enemies were powerful. Almost every ingredient needed for conspiracy was present before any writer added a single vanished sail. And the sea made everything larger. Land usually leaves tracks. Roads have witnesses. Castles can be besieged. Borders can be watched. But the sea has always been a friend to unfinished stories. Once a ship crosses the horizon, it belongs partly to fact and partly to imagination. It might be going to Portugal, Scotland, England, Aragon, or nowhere remembered. The ocean turns uncertainty into narrative permission. That permission is dangerous. It can lead us to confuse elegance with truth. The Templar fleet story feels right because it completes the drama so neatly. A persecuted order with maritime knowledge escapes a greedy king by sea and finds shelter in a kingdom where its inheritance later survives. As a narrative arc, it is almost too satisfying. History, however, is often clumsier. Men hesitate. Plans fail. Records contradict. Survival happens by compromise rather than perfect escape. And yet, dismissing the legend entirely may be too easy. There is a cautious middle position, and it may be the most honest one. We do not have to accept a grand treasure fleet to allow for smaller movements. Some Templars may have fled. Some goods may have been moved. Some documents may have disappeared into safer hands. Some brothers may have found their way to territories where the political climate was less hostile. In a crisis spread across multiple kingdoms, with information moving unevenly, it would be surprising if no one tried to preserve anything. The legend may have grown larger than the event itself. A few departures become a fleet. Protected assets become treasure. Legal survival in Portugal becomes proof of secret rescue. The absence of a clear record becomes a screen onto which later centuries project the story they want. Not defeat, but escape. This process is not unique to the Templars. Human beings often turn institutional collapse into survival myth. We do it because total destruction feels morally wrong when the defeated group seems disciplined, brave, or unjustly treated. We look for hidden heirs after dynasties fall. We look for lost manuscripts after libraries burn. We look for secret roots after massacres and purges. The mind resists the idea that power can simply crush something meaningful and leave no remainder. With the Templars, that resistance found excellent material. Their end in France was public, humiliating, and legally choreographed. Their afterlife in Portugal was real enough to keep questions alive. Their maritime world made escape conceivable. Their wealth made treasure believable. Their silence under accusation made secrecy feel natural. Later writers did not have to invent mystery from nothing. They only had to connect existing shadows with a strong line. But a strong line drawn through shadows is still not the same as proof. What then can we say? We can say that the Templars possessed the kind of networks that made movement possible. We can say that the crackdown created obvious incentives for flight and concealment. We can say that Portugal offered a more favorable environment for the preservation of Templar assets and personnel than France did. We can say that the later Order of Christ gave the story a visible point of continuity, encouraging people to look backward and imagine a secret passage from one order to the other. We cannot say with confidence that a fleet escaped La Rochelle carrying the treasure of the temple. That sentence may disappoint the part of us that wants the night departure, the sealed cargo, the final glance back toward France. But disappointment is sometimes the price of respecting the dead. The real people caught in this story deserve more than being turned into props in a treasure fantasy. Their survival, where it happened, was likely anxious, legal, partial, and compromised. In other words, human. The fleet remains powerful because it gathers many truths into one image, even if the image itself cannot be proven. It gathers the Templars' maritime capacity. It gathers the fear of arrest. It gathers the incompleteness of the records. It gathers Portugal's role as a place of transformation. It gathers the belief that institutions can outlive the sentence pronounced against them. That may be why the legend endures after so many attempts to pin it down. It is not only a claim about ships, it is a refusal to let the story end in a prison cell. And perhaps that is the best way to hold it. Not as a fact we can safely place on the table, and not as nonsense to be thrown aside, but as a myth built around real historical pressures. A myth of motion born from an age of confinement. A myth of open water born from royal control. A myth of survival born from a condemned name that, in Portugal, did not vanish as completely as its enemies intended. The fleet may or may not have sailed, as legend says, but the need for it sailed on. Long after the Templar name had been condemned, Portuguese ships began to carry a cross into waters earlier generations of Europeans had barely imagined. It is an image that tempts the mind toward a straight line. The Templars fall. Portugal preserves their inheritance. The Order of Christ rises. Then, in a later age, Portuguese sails move down the coast of Africa and outward into the Atlantic, marked by a red cross that seems to echo the older military religious world. From there, the story almost invites a dramatic conclusion. The Templars did not die. They became the hidden engine of Portugal's maritime expansion. That claim is too neat, but the echo is real. The Order of Christ became connected to Portugal's age of exploration, and its symbol would be associated with voyages that changed the map of the world. This does not mean a secret Templar navy quietly planned the future from behind monastery walls. It does not mean the missing fleet of La Rochelle transformed directly into caravels crossing unknown seas. History does not move with that kind of clean theatrical symmetry. What it does mean is subtler and perhaps more revealing. Portugal's maritime expansion did not emerge from a single cause. It grew from geography, royal ambition, trade, war, religion, technology, rivalry, and accumulated experience. The Atlantic was not merely an empty blue invitation. It was dangerous, costly, and politically useful. To send ships farther down unfamiliar coasts required money, organization, pilots, patronage, and a reason strong enough to justify the risk. The Order of Christ could serve that world because it stood at the intersection of older crusading language and newer maritime ambition. That intersection mattered. Medieval Christian warfare had long been imagined in sacred terms. The Templars belonged to that older framework, armed service under religious discipline, justified by the defense and expansion of Christendom. Portugal, facing the sea, would eventually redirect some of that energy outward. Expansion could be framed not only as trade or royal strategy, but also as mission, crusade, and spiritual enterprise. The language of holy struggle did not disappear when the battlefield changed shape. It moved onto ships. Here, the Templar inheritance becomes less a secret command structure and more a reservoir of symbols, habits, and legitimacy. The Order of Christ carried forward a model in which religious purpose and military organization could be joined under royal direction. That model was useful in a kingdom seeking to turn maritime ventures into more than private commerce. A voyage could be a business project, a political act, and a sacred endeavor all at once. The cross on the sails did not prove that the Templars controlled the ocean. It showed that Portugal's expansion could be wrapped in a memory older than exploration itself. This is where symbolism becomes powerful without needing to be conspiratorial. Symbols do not have to hide orders in code to influence history. They gather meanings. They make actions feel continuous with the past. They allow new ambitions to borrow the dignity of older causes. A ship sailing under a sacred emblem could present itself not merely as a vessel seeking profit, but as part of a larger Christian project. That mattered to kings. It mattered to clergy. It mattered to the men risking their lives at sea, and it mattered to memory. Later generations looked back at Portuguese expansion and saw the sign of the Order of Christ on sails, then looked further back and saw the Templars standing behind that order. The connection was not invented from nothing, but it was often stretched beyond what the evidence can carry. Institutional ancestry became secret continuity. Symbolic inheritance became hidden command. A real transformation became a legend of uninterrupted survival. We should slow down before making that leap. The Order of Christ was not simply the Knights Templar under another spelling. It developed within Portuguese politics. Its resources and role changed over time. Its later association with exploration belonged to a world different from the Crusader age that had produced the temple. The ships of Portugal's maritime expansion were not sailing to restore the old Templar mission in any simple sense. And yet, the past traveled with them. Not as a locked chest in the hold, perhaps, but as memory, law, emblem, and institutional habit. The old military religious idea, disciplined service, sacred authorization, organized expansion, found new uses in a kingdom turning toward the Atlantic. What had once been directed toward roads to Jerusalem and frontier castles could be reimagined along sea routes, trading posts, islands, and coastlines. That is the real continuity, not a secret line of masters whispering across centuries, a pattern of power finding a new geography. This helps explain why the Templar myth attached itself so strongly to Portugal's discoveries. The visual evidence was irresistible. Crosses on sails, an order descended in part from Templar assets, a kingdom that had preserved what others destroyed, and ships moving into the unknown. Even without hidden treasure, the image felt like destiny. The vanished fleet, if one believed in it, had not merely escaped. It had planted the seed of an empire. But history is more cautious than destiny. Portugal's maritime rise required many forces the Templars did not create: ship design, navigational practice, commercial hunger, royal policy, Atlantic island experience, competition, and the search for routes all mattered. To give the Templars credit for all of it would be to flatten centuries of Portuguese effort into one seductive myth. It would also ignore the many people who made expansion possible: sailors, pilots, shipbuilders, merchants, enslaved and coerced peoples, royal officials, missionaries, and coastal societies encountered along the way. The cross on the sails is not a single answer. It is a doorway into a more complicated story. It tells us that Portugal's future did not grow from a clean break with the medieval past. The age of exploration, often presented as the beginning of modernity, still carried medieval bones. Crusading ideals, religious orders, papal permissions, noble ambition, and sacred symbols traveled alongside calculation, profit, and curiosity. The new oceanic world was not as new as it liked to imagine. That may be the deepest Templar echo. The Templars belonged to a Europe that believed space could be sanctified by conquest, guarded by vows, and organized through armed faith. Portugal's later maritime expansion inherited parts of that mental world, even as it transformed them. The sea did not erase the old logic. It expanded the stage on which that logic could operate. So when we see the cross associated with the Order of Christ on Portuguese sails, we should neither dismiss it as decoration nor inflate it into proof of a hidden Templar master plan. It was a symbol with history behind it. It connected ships to an institution born from the ruins of the temple in Portugal. It allowed a kingdom to carry older forms of legitimacy into newer ambitions. That is enough. In fact, it may be more powerful than the conspiracy version because it shows how the past actually works. Rarely does it survive as a perfect secret. More often, it survives by being useful, by being reinterpreted, by lending authority to projects its founders never imagined. The Templar shadow did not need to steer every ship. It only needed to remain present in the institutions and symbols Portugal chose to carry forward. The harbor at La Rochelle gave the legend its escape. Tomar gave it stone. The Order of Christ gave it a legal body, and the cross on the sails gave it a future large enough for myth to enter. By then, the Templar story had changed completely. It was no longer only about imprisoned knights or missing ships. It had become part of a larger meditation on how power survives defeat. Sometimes it hides, sometimes it adapts. Sometimes it is renamed, and sometimes, centuries later, people see its echo moving across the water and wonder whether the past has really passed at all. It is easy to make the surviving Templars too mysterious. The moment we imagine them after the fall, we tend to dress them in secrecy. We place them in hidden chambers, give them forbidden knowledge, surround them with coded symbols, and make every ordinary silence feel deliberate. In that version, the former brothers become ghosts inside history, present everywhere, documented nowhere, guiding events from behind a curtain. But the men who survived were not ghosts. They were displaced religious soldiers trying to live through the collapse of the world that had named them. That is a harder story to romanticize, but it is closer to the human truth. A Templar brother was not merely a man with a sword and a cross on his mantle. He belonged to a rule. His day, his obedience, his property, his prayers, his loyalties, even his reputation before God and society, were shaped by the order. When the temple was condemned, it did not simply remove an employer. It attacked the structure through which these men understood their lafans. Some had given decades to it. Some had fought. Some had managed estates. Some had guarded roads, supplies, or strongholds. Some had joined as young men and grown old under its discipline. Then, almost suddenly, the name that had made them honorable became dangerous. Imagine the violence of that transformation. Yesterday, obedience marked you as faithful. Today, obedience may be evidence of conspiracy. Yesterday, your initiation made you a brother. Today, men ask whether that initiation concealed heresy. Yesterday, your silence showed discipline. Today, silence looks like guilt. This is what the surviving Templars had to navigate. Not just legal danger, but the collapse of meaning. In France, that collapse was brutal and public. In Portugal, the outcome was softer, but not simple. A man absorbed into a new order did not step into a clean future. He carried an old identity that had been officially stained. Survival required adaptation, and adaptation always asks for a payment. The Portuguese solution offered safety by changing the frame. Former Templar lands, and in some cases, former Templar men, could be folded into a new institution. The Order of Christ gave continuity a lawful shape. It allowed service to continue without openly defending the condemned name. It gave the crown a way to preserve utility and gave surviving brothers a way to remain within a religious military life. But no legal formula could erase memory. A former Templar in Portugal may have obeyed a new master, served under new authority, and lived within a sanctioned order. Yet he would still remember the temple. He would remember brothers arrested elsewhere. He would know the rumors. He might have heard of confessions drawn out under fear. He might have wondered who had broken, who had resisted, who had died, who had vanished, and who had quietly been given another future. That kind of memory does not need conspiracy to become powerful. It only needs grief. This is where popular history often loses the emotional scale of the story. It treats survival as triumph, as if the Templars slipped away laughing at Philip IV from the deck of a ship. But survival after disgrace is rarely so clean. If some brothers escaped prison, if some were protected, if some were reabsorbed into Portuguese life, they still survived a catastrophe. Their order had been publicly humiliated. Their vows had been questioned. Their dead had been judged under a shadow. To continue was not the same as to win. And yet, continuing mattered. The former Templars in Portugal were not occult puppeteers. They were useful men in a kingdom that still had uses for them. Their skills did not vanish with the suppression. They could manage property, hold discipline, defend territory, serve in a military religious framework, and contribute to institutions that the crown wanted to preserve. In a medieval kingdom, such men were valuable precisely because they were not ordinary. They had been trained to belong to something larger than themselves. That training could be redirected. The process must have varied from person to person. Some may have entered the new arrangement with relief, some with bitterness, some with caution. Some perhaps with the quiet pragmatism of men who had seen enough war and politics to know that survival often comes dressed as compromise. The idea of a single hidden Templar will, moving perfectly through every survivor, is too tidy. Human beings do not endure catastrophe in identical ways. Some adapt because they believe. Some adapt because they are tired. Some adapt because the alternative is a cell, exile, poverty, or death. In Portugal, adaptation had room to breathe. The crown's interests, the local value of Templar assets, and the creation of the Order of Christ made it possible for former brothers to avoid the total erasure seen elsewhere. But that survival was public enough to be useful and quiet enough to be safe. They did not need to announce themselves as the continuation of the temple. In fact, doing so would have been foolish. The old identity survived best when it was not insisted upon too loudly. That may sound paradoxical, but it is the logic of many defeated institutions. The more openly they claim continuity, the more danger they attract. The more completely they deny it, the more they lose themselves. The safest path lies between. Enough continuity to preserve function, enough change to satisfy authority. Former Templars became, in effect, men living between names, and perhaps that is why later generations found them so fascinating. A person between names is difficult to classify. Is he a Templar or not? Is the order gone or transformed? Is the new institution a true replacement, a legal fiction, a practical compromise, or a quiet rescue? The answer depends on which layer we examine: law, property, memory, personnel, symbol, or myth. Legally, the temple was gone. Humanly, some of its world remained. That distinction gives the Portuguese story its depth. It allows us to see the former brothers not as fantasy figures, but as men caught in the afterlife of an institution. They were not wandering shadows. They had bodies, duties, fears, habits, and loyalties. They lived in places like Tomar, under rulers like Dinis, within political structures that demanded caution. They survived not by escaping history, but by being absorbed into it. And absorption is not disappearance. A drop of ink in water does not remain a drop, but the water is changed. The Templar survivors in Portugal changed the institutions that received them, just as those institutions changed them. Their past gave weight to the order of Christ. Their properties shaped its foundation. Their memory contributed to its aura. Over time, the hard edges softened. The scandal receded. The new name became normal. But beneath that normality lay the fact of transition. Men once attached to one of the most controversial orders in Europe had found a way to continue under another banner. This is not the stuff of cheap legend. It is quieter and more tragic. Because the real mystery is not whether they kept secret rituals in the dark. It is how a man continues after the story he believed about himself has been condemned by the world. How he prays, how he obeys, how he explains his past, how he serves a new institution without feeling that he has betrayed the old one entirely. The former Templars in Portugal were survivors, not ghosts. They did not need to haunt history. They had already endured it. At this point, the story asks for honesty. Not the kind that drains mystery from the past, but the kind that gives the mystery its proper shape. The Templars have been followed through accusation, arrest, rumor, geography, legal survival, and memory. We have seen why La Rochelle became such a powerful image, why Portugal mattered, why Tomar gives the story stone beneath its feet, and why the Order of Christ made survival more than a fantasy. But now the question returns in its simplest form. What can we actually say? We can say, with confidence, that the Knights Templar became a wealthy and influential military religious order whose privileges and resources made them both useful and resented. Their rise was not a fairy tale of hidden wisdom. It was built through donations, discipline, landholding, warfare, logistics, and papal protection. We can say that Philip IV of France had strong political and financial motives to move against them. That does not mean every decision can be reduced to one unpaid debt or one greedy impulse, but it does mean the attack cannot be understood apart from royal power. The accusations of heresy served a purpose larger than moral investigation. They made destruction possible. We can say that the arrests of October 13th, 1307, were real, coordinated, and devastating. The charges were extreme. The interrogations were coercive. Torture and pressure shaped the confessions that followed. Any reading of the evidence must account for the conditions under which much of that evidence was produced. A confession extracted in fear is not a window. It is a broken mirror. We can say that the order was suppressed and that its name became impossible to defend in its old form. The Templars did not simply continue across Europe as if nothing had happened. The blow was real. Men suffered. Leaders died. Properties were seized or transferred. The institution that had once stood at the center of crusading life was publicly dismantled. We can also say that Portugal did not respond exactly like France. This matters. King Dinis did not embrace the same level of destructive zeal. The Portuguese Templar inheritance had practical value inside his kingdom. Through political patience and legal maneuvering, much of that inheritance was eventually carried into the Order of Christ. This is not speculation in the same way the secret fleet is speculation. The Portuguese transformation is the firmer part of the story. The old name ended. A new sanctioned body received much of what the old one had made useful. That is the strongest bridge between the Templars and Portugal. Now we come to the ships. Here, confidence must give way to caution. The claim that a Templar fleet escaped from La Rochelle, carrying treasure, fugitives, or secret archives remains disputed. It is not supported by the kind of contemporary evidence that would allow us to present it as fact. The story survives through later accounts, inference, gaps, and the plausibility created by the Templars' real maritime world. The weaker claim is possible. Some men may have fled, some assets may have moved, some records may have been protected, and maritime routes may have played a role in survival. The stronger claim, a dramatic fleet vanishing with the central treasure of the order, belongs closer to legend. The difference is not a small one. It is the difference between a historical possibility and a historical conclusion. This is where many versions of the Templar story go wrong. They treat uncertainty as permission. A missing record becomes proof of suppression. A later rumor becomes an eyewitness account. A symbolic connection becomes a hidden chain of command. One can build an entire secret history this way, but it rests on air. The more beautiful the structure becomes, the more carefully we should ask what is holding it up. And yet skepticism has its own danger. If we dismiss everything that cannot be proven in the strictest sense, we may miss how people in the past actually survived. Not all survival leaves a clean document. Not every frightened man signs his name to an escape. Not every transfer of knowledge appears in an archive. The absence of proof does not always mean nothing happened. It means we must speak in degrees. The records allow us to say that Portugal preserved important parts of the Templar inheritance. They do not allow us to say that Portugal received a secret treasure fleet from La Rochelle. They allow us to see continuity through property, institutions, and royal policy. They do not allow us to prove a hidden Templar master plan behind Portuguese expansion. They allow us to trace echoes. They do not allow us to turn every echo into a voice. That may feel less satisfying than certainty, but it is more respectful to the material. History is not a courtroom drama where every mystery ends with a confession. It is often a landscape of partial visibility. Some roads are paved, some vanish into scrub. Some are drawn on later maps because people wished they had existed. The Templar story in Portugal sits across all three. There is firm ground: the fall of the order, the Portuguese response, the creation of the Order of Christ, the importance of places like Tomar. There is plausible ground: limited escape, movement of men or resources, the survival of skills and networks beyond formal suppression. And there is legendary ground: vast treasure, perfectly secret fleets, hidden doctrines, uninterrupted conspiracies guiding later centuries. The honest storyteller does not have to choose between wonder and discipline. He has to place each piece where it belongs. The wonder, in this case, does not disappear when the legend is trimmed. It changes. The most astonishing part may not be that ships vanished into the Atlantic with gold in their holds. It may be that a condemned institution left enough behind in Portugal to be renamed, reauthorized, and redirected into the future. That is less flashy than treasure. It is also harder to explain away, because it shows how power survives in real life. Not always by escaping, sometimes by being useful to the next ruler, sometimes by accepting a new name, sometimes by letting memory travel quietly inside law. So what happened at La Rochelle? The records do not let us close the case. Maybe ships left. Maybe the story grew from smaller movements. Maybe later, imagination attached itself to an empty harbor because the official ending felt too complete, too cruel, too convenient for the king who profited from it. What happened in Portugal is clearer. There, the Templar legacy did not vanish cleanly. It passed through danger, changed its form, and entered a new institution with a future of its own. The order was dead in law, but not all of its substance was dead in practice. That is the line the evidence allows us to walk. On one side, the prison. On the other, the sea. And between them, Portugal. Not as a fantasy refuge beyond history, but as the place where history found a way to make survival legal. In the end, the Templars did die. We should not soften that too much. Their name was condemned. Their leaders were broken by trial, prison, and execution. Their reputation was dragged through charges that still cling to them centuries later. Across Europe, properties changed hands, brothers were scattered, and one of the most famous military orders in Christendom ceased to exist in the form that had made it feared and admired. But history has a strange patience. It lets names die while other things continue breathing underneath them. In Portugal, the Templar story did not end as cleanly as Philip IV might have wished. The old order could not remain openly intact. The accusations had done too much damage, and papal authority had spoken too loudly. Yet the Portuguese crown saw what could still be used: lands, castles, discipline, experience, and the long memory of service on a frontier. Under King Dinis, destruction became a problem to be managed, not a fire to be fed. That is why the Order of Christ matters. It was not a perfect resurrection. It was not the temple stepping out of a hidden doorway, unchanged and triumphant. It was something more believable. A sanctioned transformation. A new name. A new legal body. A Portuguese solution to a European catastrophe. The Templars were destroyed in law. In Portugal, parts of their inheritance were reorganized into life. This is where the legend and the record meet, but do not become the same thing. The secret fleet of La Rochelle remains uncertain. It may preserve a memory of real movement, or it may be a later answer to an old emotional need. The records do not allow us to place treasure ships confidently on the Atlantic, sailing away from France with the Order's deepest secrets beneath their decks. But the story endured because it points toward something that was true in a wider sense. The Templars did not vanish completely. Their world left marks, not in the form of a hidden empire, but in stone, property, symbols, institutions, and men who learned to survive by adaptation. Tomar remembered. Portugal remembered. The Order of Christ carried forward an inheritance that had passed through condemnation and come out altered, but not empty. Later, when Portuguese ships moved under the sign of the cross, the echo grew louder, and people began to wonder how much of the old temple still moved inside the new age. The safest answer is also the most interesting. Enough survived to matter. Not everything. Not the order as it had been. Not the fantasy of untouched secrecy. But enough. Enough for Portugal to preserve a military religious tradition useful to the crown. Enough for former Templar assets to shape a new institution. Enough for later generations to look backward and feel that the official ending had missed something. Enough for a harbor, a fortress, and a cross on a sail to become pieces of one long, unresolved memory. Perhaps that is why the Templars remain so difficult to leave behind. Their fall contains injustice, ambition, fear, and spectacle. Their afterlife contains ambiguity, and ambiguity is where memory lives longest. A clean ending becomes a date in a book. An uncertain ending becomes a doorway. So did part of the Order escape by sea? Maybe. The evidence is too thin to say more. Did Portugal become a sanctuary? In the practical language of medieval power, yes. Not necessarily as a hiding place for a secret fleet, but as a kingdom where the Templar inheritance could be protected, renamed, and made useful again. That distinction is the heart of the story. The real survival was not a perfect escape from history. It was survival through history, through law, compromise, royal calculation, and the stubborn value of what the Templars had built. Their enemies could destroy the name. They could not so easily destroy the habits, lands, and memories already rooted in Portugal. And maybe that is the final lesson. Power does not always survive by remaining visible, nor does it survive only by hiding. Sometimes it survives by changing its face at the exact moment the world expects it to disappear. At La Rochelle, the legend gives us silent ships. At Tomar, the stones give us something firmer. Between them lies the truth as far as we can approach it. An order destroyed, an inheritance transformed, and a shadow that passed from one age into another. Not immortal, not untouched, but unwilling to die completely.